Frank Delaney adjusted his tie in the mirror of the men's room at the Rusty Fork Diner. It was the kind of place that hadn't changed since 1978, with its red vinyl booths, waitresses named Barb or Nancy, and coffee that tasted like burnt hope. Tonight, though, it felt almost elegant. Emily had reserved the back room, draped it with fairy lights, and filled the air with quiet joy. She deserved it. After the heartbreak she'd endured 3 years ago, this second chance at love seemed like the fresh start Frank had prayed for. He stepped out into the warm buzz of clinking glasses and soft laughter. The cake, a 3-layer cream dream with blue floral piping, sat untouched at the center of the table. Emily looked radiant, beaming at Jason Whitmore, her new husband, who wore a crisp blazer and the kind of watch that didn't belong on a schoolteacher's budget. Frank took his seat slowly, ignoring the stiffness in his knees. A waitress refilled their glasses with sparkling cider. Frank stood and raised his. "To my daughter," he began, voice steady, clear. "Emily, you have always been my sunshine, even on the darkest days. Your mother would be proud. And to Jason, welcome to the family. May your marriage be full of kindness, patience, and above all, respect." Emily dabbed at her eyes. Jason smiled and raised his glass. "To new beginnings." They toasted, and Frank sat down. The warmth of the room soaked into him like a blanket. Maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. Then Jason leaned forward. "You know, Frank," he said casually, his wine glass catching the glow of a hanging Edison bulb, "Emily and I were thinking it might make sense for you to downsize." Frank blinked. "Downsize?" Jason nodded, as if discussing a harmless DIY project. "Yeah, you know, the house is pretty big for one person. Too much space, too many stairs. We were talking, and the Pines Retirement Village has some great options for active seniors." Emily shifted in her seat, smile faltering. "The house?" Frank repeated, setting his fork down slowly. "You mean the one I built with my own hands in '99? Jason gave a polite chuckle. "Exactly. It's a great place, but it's not practical for someone your age, Frank. Plus, Emily and I could use a stable place to start a family. That house, it has potential. Backyard, 3 bedrooms, great schools nearby." Frank's hands gripped the edge of the table. The cake suddenly tasted like chalk in his mouth. Emily reached across the table. "Dad, please don't take this the wrong way. He's just brainstorming. We love you." Frank didn't answer right away. He looked around the table. No one else seemed to notice that the air had gone cold. Other diners laughed and talked, oblivious to the tiny earthquake cracking through Frank's chest. "Jason," he said, voice calm, "you've been married to my daughter for 2 days. Jason smiled. "Exactly. We're a team now. We're thinking long term. It's just, your house is such a valuable asset. It seems silly not to use it in a way that benefits all of us." "An asset," Frank repeated like he was tasting a foreign word. "Dad," Emily tried again, "let's not do this here." But Frank wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't making a scene. He simply straightened his shoulders and looked Jason square in the eye. "At my age," he said slowly, "I'm still fully capable of making decisions about my own property. You and Emily are welcome to stay for a few days while you look for a place. But that house, my house, isn't part of your plan." For a flicker of a second, Jason's face changed. Something behind the smile, a flicker of calculation, maybe even contempt, peeked through before vanishing. "Of course," Jason said, still grinning. "No pressure, just a thought." But his tone had lost its warmth. It was a performance now, and Frank wasn't clapping. They finished the dinner with polite silence. Frank paid the check, $68, plus a generous tip. On the way to the parking lot, Emily caught his sleeve. "He didn't mean anything by it," she whispered. "Jason just worries. We both do." Frank looked at her, really looked at her. She was glowing, yes, but there was tension in her jaw, worry in her eyes. "I know you mean well, honey," he said, "but you just got married. You shouldn't be worrying about my living arrangements." "I know," she said, and then added more softly, "Just don't shut him out too fast." Frank nodded. He didn't want to argue, not tonight. The drive back to Maplewood was quiet. The headlights carved a tunnel through the Oregon mist, and Frank's thoughts rattled louder than the engine. As he pulled into his driveway, a modest 2-story ranch with cedar siding and the porch light still on, he felt an old, familiar ache. The kind that came when people mistook kindness for weakness. Inside, he hung his coat, fed the cat, and poured himself a finger of whiskey. He stood in the kitchen, watching shadows stretch across the backyard, remembering the years he'd spent planting those trees, repainting the fence, sealing the deck. The house wasn't just lumber and drywall. It was memory. He walked past Jason's duffel bag near the stairs. It was half unzipped. Frank bent down to zip it up and noticed something strange inside. An envelope with real estate brochures, retirement homes, quick-sale property companies, appraisal forms. Frank stood frozen for a second, then straightened. He didn't open the envelope. Not yet, but something inside him had clicked. He went upstairs, nodded at Jason and Emily, already in their room, door cracked open, and then retreated to his study. He opened the drawer where Margaret's journal still rested. She'd given it to him when he retired. "So you don't drive me crazy with all your mental spreadsheets?" she'd joked. He opened to a blank page and wrote, "March 2nd, Jason suggested I move out, used the word asset. Unsettling. Watch behavior." He paused, then added, "Trust, but verify," Margaret's favorite phrase. Frank closed the journal and stared at the wall for a long time. Downstairs, Jason's laugh echoed faintly through the vent. Frank didn't smile. Not tonight. Frank Delaney wasn't a paranoid man. He'd worked with machines most of his life, circuit boards, processors, logic gates, things that either functioned or didn't. But people? People were harder to read. They could smile while lying, hug while planning. And ever since the dinner at the Rusty Fork, something about Jason Whitmore didn't add up. The morning sun broke through the kitchen blinds in thin slices, and Frank sipped his coffee slowly, staring into the steam. He could hear Jason in the backyard talking on the phone. Too far to catch words, but close enough to note the tone. Confident, direct, not the kind of voice used for casual chats. He opened the back door quietly and stepped onto the deck, pretending to check the bird feeder. Jason turned mid-sentence and ended the call too fast. "Morning, Frank," he said. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." Frank looked at the empty cup in Jason's hand. "Coffee's on." Jason smiled. "Thanks. I was just making some calls. Emily and I are thinking about taking a short honeymoon, maybe up to Seattle." Frank nodded, pretending to be distracted by the feeder. "Sounds good." Jason stepped past him into the kitchen, and Frank watched him go. The voice, the brochures, the bag. It wasn't just one thing anymore. It was a pattern. Later that afternoon, Frank was in the garage replacing a leaky faucet for the basement sink when his neighbor Walt Morgan wandered in. Walt had been a beat cop in Portland for 30 years before retiring to Maplewood. He looked like a man who still ironed his socks. "Hey, Frank," Walt called out. "Got a sec?" Frank wiped his hands on a rag. Always. Walt leaned against the workbench. "Didn't mean to pry, but I saw someone taking pictures around your place yesterday. Guy in a black windbreaker. Had one of those fancy measuring wheels." Frank frowned. "You sure it wasn't from the city? Utility check or something?" Walt shook his head. "No logo, no clipboard. Just snapping shots of your foundation and driveway. He left in a black Ford Fusion. No plates up front." Frank's jaw tightened. "Jason was home yesterday." Walt gave a low whistle. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "I hope I'm wrong," Frank said. "But no, Walt, I don't think you are." Back inside, Frank sat at his desk and opened his laptop. He wasn't great with technology, but he knew his way around a browser. He started with Jason's name. Nothing odd at first. LinkedIn, faculty page from a private middle school in Eugene, a few pictures. But deeper down the rabbit hole, things got hazy. There were other names, aliases with similar profiles, overlapping resumes, same smile, same voice. A few blogs, mostly complaints, one Reddit thread titled "Elder Scammer Pretends to be the Perfect Son-in-Law." He clicked on it. He married my aunt in Arizona. 2 months later, her house was in his name. Then he vanished. Frank leaned back, breath shallow. He opened a new tab and checked the browser history on the shared desktop Jason had used yesterday. Searches: Oregon deed transfer elder parent, power of attorney Oregon requirements, sell home without consent. Frank's fingers froze on the trackpad. This was no misunderstanding. It was a plan. He called Thomas Granger. "You're sure you want to get into this?" Thomas asked, voice grave. "This isn't small-time stuff. If he's who I think he is, he's worked several states." "I'm sure," Frank said. "I want to catch him before he catches someone else." Thomas agreed to dig around and connect Frank with a few past clients. In the meantime, Frank created a spreadsheet. Names, timelines, locations. Margaret would have laughed. He was making another project folder. That night, Emily made pasta. She and Jason chatted at the table while Frank picked at his food. Jason reached for the Parmesan. "Hey Frank, quick question. Do you happen to know if the furnace still has the original warranty? We were talking about getting the whole system appraised just to see if it's still efficient." Frank looked up slowly. "The furnace?" Jason didn't blink. "Yeah, and the roof. Might need work. If you're thinking about resale value down the line, it helps to know." Emily added, "He's just trying to help, Dad." Frank nodded, forcing a smile. "Appreciate the concern. I'll handle it." Jason raised his glass. "Teamwork, right?" Frank raised his too, but didn't drink. That night, he wrote in the journal again. March 4th. Walt saw man taking photos. Browser history confirmed. Jason searching deed transfers. Contacted Thomas. "This is real." He paused. "Must stay calm. Play dumb. Trap requires patience." The next morning, Thomas called back. "I've got a name you should speak to, Eleanor Martinez. Lost her home to someone matching Jason's description. I'll email her number." Frank called Eleanor an hour later. Her voice trembled on the phone. "He said he loved me," she began. "Said I reminded him of his mother. I signed the house over after we married. He said it was for tax purposes. He left 2 weeks later. I haven't seen a dime since." Frank listened in silence. "I'm sorry," he said when she finished. "But thank you." Eleanor gave him a second name, Robert Chen in Montana. Frank emailed him that evening. "Hi, Robert. You don't know me, but I believe we have a predator in common." Robert responded within the hour. 3 sentences, same face, different name. He took everything. "I'll cooperate." Frank printed out their responses. The folder was getting thicker and heavier. He didn't feel fear. He felt focused. Later that evening, as Jason took a long shower, Frank slipped into the guest room and searched Jason's bag again. This time, deeper inside, beneath a shirt, he found it, a small black USB drive. He pocketed it. Back in his office, he plugged it into an old laptop disconnected from Wi-Fi. There were documents, scanned deeds, contracts, power of attorney templates, all unsigned, but all pre-filled, dozens of names, some in Oregon, some in Arizona, one of them his own. Frank sat in silence, hand resting on the mouse. This wasn't just Jason trying to help. It was theft, identity manipulation, targeted fraud. He clicked open his voice memo app and practiced. "If you're willing, Mr. Delaney, we can set up a sting." He said it out loud. Then, almost on cue, the phone rang. "Frank Delaney?" the woman's voice asked. "Detective Rachel Stone, Maplewood PD. I was referred by Thomas Granger. He says you may have information on a serial financial predator." Frank swallowed, then answered with quiet strength. "Yes, Detective, I believe I do, and I'm ready to catch him." Frank Delaney never believed in revenge. Justice, yes, but revenge was messy, emotional, irrational. He was an engineer by trade and by nature. Every wire had a purpose, every circuit a flow. The situation with Jason Whitmore required that same cold precision. Detective Rachel Stone met Frank at the Maplewood Police Department the following afternoon. She was younger than he expected, maybe mid-40s, but carried herself like someone who had seen more than her fair share of betrayal. "I've read through the statements from Eleanor Martinez and Robert Chen," she said, flipping through the file. "There's a pattern. Same method, same timeline, different names. If your son-in-law fits this, he's not just a scammer, he's a serial felon." Frank nodded. "He's working on me right now. It won't be long before he makes his move." Rachel leaned in. "Then we need to get ahead of him." They laid it out like a blueprint. Rachel would assign 2 undercover officers to watch the house. Frank would wear a wire and have a panic button on him at all times. Any attempt by Jason to coerce or falsify legal documents would be recorded. They needed Jason on tape, clean, undeniable evidence. Frank returned home that evening with the calm of someone who had already seen the ending. He smiled at Jason, complimented his tie, asked about Emily's new lesson plans. Jason grinned back, playing his role to perfection. That night, Frank sat in his study, flipping through Margaret's old journal. He He remembered how she used to write in the margins, little notes about him. One said, "Frank never says much, but he sees everything." He added a new entry to his own, March 5th, operation begins, Rachel Stone, capable, evidence mounting, Jason unaware, patience still key. The next few days were slow by design. Frank gave Jason space. He invited him to Home Depot for supplies, asked his advice on repainting the garage. Jason, sensing victory, relaxed. He became confident, even smug. Emily was too busy with school to notice the subtle shift in their home. On March 9th, Jason made his first real move. Frank was in the kitchen when Jason stepped in with a folder. "Hey, Frank," he said, casual. "So I talked to a guy I know, Cliff Langston. He's a notary, super professional, clean background. Said he could help you handle the house paperwork, streamline things." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Paperwork?" "Just in case you ever want to go forward with the retirement plan. No pressure. But if you're ever ready, Cliff's your guy, and he's happy to come by for a chat." Frank took the folder, flipped through it, mostly boilerplate documents, but one stood out, a property transfer form, blank signature line. Frank smiled politely. "I'll keep it in mind." Jason nodded, then added, "It's good to be prepared." That night, Frank reviewed the documents with Thomas Granger over the phone. Thomas confirmed the form was authentic, but unsigned. It meant nothing. Yet, but it was enough to build on. The following morning, Rachel dropped off the wire kit and trained Frank on how to use the panic device. "We'll be listening the whole time," she assured him. "Don't try to provoke him. Let him dig his own hole." "I'm good at quiet," Frank said. They shook hands. By March 11th, Jason was growing bolder. He walked into Frank's study after dinner, uninvited, holding 2 coffees. "Thought we could chat," he said, handing Frank a mug. Frank gestured to the chair across from him. "Sure." Jason set the coffee down and pulled out a small brochure for the Pines Retirement Village. "They've got 2-bed units," he said. "Easy living, no maintenance. You'd be around people your age, could even do woodworking again. They've got a hobby center." Frank looked over the page. It was glossy, cheerful. "You've done your research," he said. Jason smiled. "I care about you, Frank, and let's be honest. Emily and I could really make use of this place. It's not about greed, it's about efficiency." Frank let that hang in the air before replying. "You know what's funny about efficiency, Jason? In engineering, it only works when all inputs are honest. You can't build stability on false numbers." Jason tilted his head, unsure if it was a compliment or a warning. "Fair enough," he said. "Still, let me know if you want Cliff to swing by this weekend." Frank nodded. "I will." Rachel listened to the whole exchange from a van parked across the street. She made notes, marked timestamps, and sent copies to the DA's office. On March 14th, Jason set the trap, or so he thought. He knocked on Frank's door around 10 a.m., freshly shaved, folder in hand. "Cliff's here," he said. "Just to talk. No pressure." Frank opened the door wide. "Perfect timing. Coffee's fresh." Cliff Langston was thin, gray-haired, wearing a tie that didn't quite match his suit. He had a black briefcase and the nervous energy of a man doing something illegal for the first time. They sat at the kitchen table. Jason did most of the talking. "Frank's agreed to transfer the deed as part of an early inheritance. Saves on estate tax." Cliff nodded, pulling out documents. "Standard stuff. Just need a signature and a witness." Frank reached for his reading glasses. Rachel's voice buzzed softly in his earpiece. "Confirm his intent. Don't sign." Frank looked up, pen in hand. "Just to be clear, this document gives ownership of the house to Emily and you?" Jason smiled. "Well, technically just to me for now. Easier for paperwork. But of course, it's our house." Frank nodded slowly, set the pen down. "Before we sign, how about we make a quick stop at the Maplewood police station, just to make sure everything's airtight?" Cliff froze. Jason's smile cracked. "What?" Frank stood. "It's the responsible thing. You know me, always about the details." Jason stood too, voice rising. "Frank, that's unnecessary. You think I'm trying to screw you over?" Frank looked him dead in the eye. "I don't think, Jason. I know." Rachel burst through the back door with 2 officers right behind her. "Jason Whitmore, you are under arrest for attempted elder exploitation, conspiracy to commit fraud, and identity manipulation." Jason's mouth hung open. Cliff tried to run, but the second officer caught him before he reached the door. Frank stepped back, heart pounding but steady. Rachel turned to him. "We got it all. Every word." Jason spat. "You set me up." Frank shook his head. "No, you set yourself up. I just hit record." As they led Jason out in cuffs, Emily stood at the bottom of the stairs, pale, holding the railing. She looked at her father, then at the man she thought she knew, and said nothing. Frank Delaney hadn't slept much. After Jason and Cliff were taken away in squad cars, the house had felt quieter, but not peaceful. Emily had gone to her room without a word. She hadn't spoken to her father or answered any of Rachel's questions. The betrayal was too fresh, too massive to process in a single night. Frank understood. He didn't press her. He sat in his study until nearly dawn, going over every document, email, and recording again, not because he had to, but because that's what engineers do. They review, they verify, and in this case, they prepare for what comes next. At 7:04 a.m., Rachel Stone called. "They're both in holding," she said. "Jason hasn't said a word. Cliff is already cracking, wants a deal." Frank exhaled. "Good. We'll need your testimony," Rachel added, "and maybe more." "I'm ready." And he was. What started as a man defending his home had become something bigger, a chance to expose a predator who had roamed freely for too long. Later that morning, Frank stepped out onto his porch. Walt Morgan was watering his lawn across the street. The ex-cop lifted his chin in greeting. "Heard the sirens yesterday," Walt said. Frank nodded. "Got him." Walt smiled faintly. "Knew you would. You didn't build that house to give it away." Frank chuckled, the sound low and brief. "No, I didn't." Inside, Emily stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee slowly. Her eyes were red, but she was calm. "You okay?" Frank asked. She nodded but didn't speak right away. "I read the statement Rachel sent over," she finally said. "The evidence, the other victims, the USB drive." Frank waited. "I feel like a fool." He shook his head. "You're not. You were lied to by someone trained to lie. That's not on you." Emily looked at him. "He used me. He used all of us, but it ends now." She sat at the table. "What happens next?" Frank poured himself a cup and joined her. Prosecution, trial. Maybe press. Rachel thinks there are victims in 3 more states. The DA wants to charge him federally. Emily was quiet. Then, "Will you testify?" Frank nodded. "Every word." She took a long sip. "Then so will I." That afternoon, Frank drove to the Multnomah County Courthouse in Portland for a pre-hearing meeting. The city buzzed with traffic and late winter drizzle. He wore a charcoal blazer, not new, but pressed. Rachel met him inside, folder in hand. "The DA is impressed," she said. "You did more groundwork than some of our detectives." Frank smiled. "Just did what had to be done." "We're offering Cliff a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation," Rachel explained. "He's already handed over Jason's alias list and banking info." "Good. Let him talk." Jason appeared on screen during the video hearing. He wore county orange and a smug expression, like this was all a misunderstanding that would blow over. It wouldn't. The judge denied bail. The charges were read aloud: wire fraud, identity theft, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, conspiracy. Frank listened without flinching. Outside the courtroom, Rachel walked with him to the curb. "You know," she said, "a lot of victims in your shoes wouldn't have had the clarity or the guts to pull this off." Frank looked out over the courthouse steps, rain spattering against the sidewalk. "I wasn't just protecting a house," he said. "I was protecting everything it stood for." That evening, back in Maplewood, Frank sat with Emily in the living room. The fire crackled. A quilt lay across her lap. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow," she said. He didn't answer with words, just reached over and took her hand. "I'll be okay," she added, eyes fixed on the fire. "But I won't forget this." "You shouldn't. I feel stupid for not seeing it sooner." Frank's voice was soft. "Sometimes love makes us look with our hearts, not our eyes. That's not stupid. That's human. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it quickly. I just wanted something good. I know. They sat in silence a while, letting the fire fill the spaces words couldn't. The next day, the first reporter came calling. A woman named Shelby Hart from the Oregon Sentinel showed up at Frank's door. Mr. Delaney, I've spoken with 2 other victims from Jason's past. Your name keeps coming up. You didn't just catch him, you stopped him. Frank hesitated. I'm not interested in fame. Shelby smiled gently. This isn't about fame. It's about warning others, giving people hope. He agreed to an interview under one condition: no photos of Emily. Over the next week, the story spread. Local TV, online papers, even a spot on a national radio program. Frank became the unexpected face of elder justice. Strangers sent letters, thank you cards. Some shared their own stories of manipulation and loss. One note stood out. It was from a man in Idaho. My mother died penniless because of him. Thank you for ending the cycle. You're a good man, Mr. Delaney. Frank kept that letter on his desk. Rachel called again on March 23rd. We're pushing for a July trial, she said. Plenty of time to prepare. I'm ready now, Frank replied. I know you are. Before hanging up, she added, You've got a real future in advocacy if you want it. He laughed. One battle at a time. Still, the idea lingered. Emily came downstairs that evening holding a photo album. Found this in the garage. Frank smiled. I thought I lost that. They flipped through it together. Margaret in her garden, Emily at prom, Frank in a goofy Halloween costume with a cardboard robot suit. It felt like breathing again. You know, Emily said, closing the album, I used to be scared of growing old. Frank looked at her. But now, she continued, I think I just didn't know what growing strong looked like. He squeezed her shoulder. It looks like this. The courtroom was quiet, almost reverent, as Frank Delaney took the stand. Multnomah County Courthouse had seen its fair share of drama, custody battles, gang trials, property disputes, but this case had struck a chord. Not because of the money involved, but because of the people. Older Americans, often forgotten, suddenly had a champion. And that champion was a retired engineer in a brown tweed jacket who wore calm like armor. Frank looked across the room. Jason Whitmore sat at the defense table, hair trimmed, suit borrowed. His smile was gone. So was the charm. All that remained was the weight of a dozen accusations and the eyes of those he'd betrayed. The prosecuting attorney, Marla Kent, approached the podium. Mr. Delaney, can you please tell the court in your own words what happened? Frank cleared his throat. Jason married my daughter. 2 days later, he suggested I move into a retirement home, called my house an asset, said it would benefit all of us. At first, I thought it was poor taste. Then I found real estate brochures in his bag, searched his browser history. It wasn't an accident, it was a pattern. He went on, explaining the fake notary, the wire, the audio recordings, the USB drive. Marla nodded. And why didn't you simply throw him out? Frank gave a small smile. Because if I did, he'd just try again somewhere else. I wasn't interested in punishment. I wanted prevention. Jason's attorney objected, but the judge allowed the statement. Frank sat for cross-examination without flinching. Every word was measured, not angry, not emotional, just true. By the end of the day, Jason's team looked rattled. Cliff Langston testified next. He'd taken a deal, 18 months in exchange for full cooperation. His voice shook as he recounted how Jason had approached him with a foolproof plan to skim houses from lonely seniors. He said the key was making them feel like family, Cliff said. Said they'd sign anything if you smiled enough. Gasps rippled through the room. In the back row, Emily sat still, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale but resolute. Marla played the audio recordings next. Jason's voice filled the room. The house will be ours by the end of the month. He's old. He'll cave. Frank didn't flinch. The jury listened intently. Every calculated word Jason had said behind Frank's back was now a nail in his legal coffin. By the time court adjourned for the day, the tide had fully turned. That evening, Frank and Emily sat on the porch steps, watching the sun dip behind the tree line. He looks so small in there, Emily whispered. Frank didn't respond. I keep replaying everything, she continued. The dinner, the honeymoon talks, even the way he tied his shoes, like I missed it all. You didn't miss it, Frank said. You just trusted someone you shouldn't have. That's not on you. She looked over at him. Do you think he ever loved me? Frank didn't answer right away. I think he loved what you gave him. Access, protection, a name. But no, I don't think he knew how to love. Emily wiped her eyes. Then I'm glad I know now. 2 days later, closing arguments were delivered. Marla Kent laid it out plainly. Jason Whitmore is not just a manipulator. He is a predator. He targeted vulnerability, used marriage as a mask, and sought to strip dignity from those who built this country with their hands and their sweat. If not for Mr. Delaney's intelligence and courage, we might never have known. The defense tried to argue mental health, financial pressure, emotional instability, but the evidence stood firm. The jury returned in less than 5 hours. Guilty on all counts. Jason's expression didn't change, not when the verdict was read, not when the handcuffs clicked, but as he was let out, he looked at Frank, and for the first time, there was no smirk. Just silence. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around Frank. Do you feel vindicated? Are you proud? Any message for others facing elder abuse? Frank looked into the cameras, voice steady. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. If you're being targeted, speak up. If someone's making you feel small, fight back. You're not weak, you're just being underestimated. He turned and walked away before the cameras could ask more. The story made headlines across Oregon. Maplewood man exposes national scam. Retired engineer brings down serial fraudster. Justice for the forgotten. Frank didn't read the articles. He didn't need to. He spent the next few weeks repairing the garden, trimming hedges, repainting the porch swing. Work was healing. Work made sense. Emily moved back into her old room temporarily. She started therapy, joined a support group for victims of financial abuse. They had coffee every morning on the porch, just like Frank used to do with Margaret. One afternoon, she said, I thought this house was just wood and paint, but it's not. It's you. It's Mom. It's everything we built. Frank smiled. That's why I fought. Then, in early May, an envelope arrived. Return address, U.S. Department of Justice. Inside, a request. Would you consider speaking at the Elder Fraud Awareness Summit in D.C.? This October, your story has already inspired thousands. We'd be honored. Frank looked at the letter, then out at the yard where his dogwood tree was blooming. He didn't say yes right away, but he didn't throw it out either. 8 weeks had passed since the verdict. Frank Delaney stood on the front steps of the courthouse one last time, dressed in the same pressed blazer, holding the same brown briefcase. Inside were documents finalizing Jason Whitmore's sentencing. 12 years, no parole for the first 7, and a federal investigation still pending in Arizona and Montana. Justice had come not with fireworks, but with quiet, precise accountability. Frank descended the steps slowly, nodding at Rachel Stone, who waited near the curb. You did good, Frank, she said. He gave her a faint smile. We did. She offered her hand. If you ever get bored being retired, we've got a whole department of fraud cases that could use your kind of thinking. Frank chuckled. Let me catch up on my garden first. Back in Maplewood, the house felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because the weight of intrusion had finally lifted. No more pretending, no more shadows. Emily was packing up her things, slowly, with care. She was moving into a small rental nearby, starting over on her own terms. Her divorce had finalized 2 weeks ago, her maiden name restored. It was a quiet victory. You sure you don't want to stay a bit longer? Frank asked. She smiled. Dad, you finally got your house back. I'm not about to crowd it again. You were never the problem. She paused. Still, I need to figure out who I am without anyone else deciding for me. Frank respected that. That evening they sat on the porch swing, sipping tea. The dogwood tree swayed gently in the breeze. I keep thinking about Mom, Emily said softly, how she would have handled all this. Frank looked up at the sky turning amber. She would have punched Jason in the face before I even got suspicious. Emily laughed, and for the first time in months, the sound was real. You know, she added, I used to think strength was loud, big gestures, anger, but watching you, I think maybe it's something else. Frank turned to her. I think strength is quiet. It waits, it watches, it builds a case while everyone else talks. Frank didn't say anything, just reached over and squeezed her hand. Later that week, Walt Morgan stopped by with a six-pack and a smile. You see the article in Modern Defender? He asked, holding up the magazine. They're calling you the grandfather who outsmarted a scammer. Frank rolled his eyes. Catchy. Walt laughed. Could have been worse. They almost went with the deed defender. Frank cracked a smile. That sounds like a bad superhero. Walt sat on the steps. How's Emily? Stronger every day. Walt nodded, then said, You ever think about what comes next? Frank raised an eyebrow. Retirement from retirement? Maybe just the next chapter. That evening, Frank went through the mail. Another letter from D.C. A follow-up on the Elder Fraud Summit, this time with a plane ticket included. First class. Emily watched him from the kitchen. You should go. Frank looked at the ticket. You think they want an old guy rambling about home maintenance and gut instinct? She tilted her head. I think they want someone who reminds people not to underestimate what looks ordinary. He didn't answer, but he didn't throw the ticket away either. 2 days later, Frank drove to a local community center where Rachel had set up a small elder protection workshop. She spotted him near the back and waved him forward. Hey, she whispered, want to say a few words? Frank hesitated, then stepped up. The room held about 30 people, mostly seniors, a few social workers, one teenager who looked like he was there on court-ordered community service. Frank looked out and said, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a cop. I'm just a guy who noticed when something felt off. And instead of brushing it away, I followed it. That's all it takes. You don't have to be brilliant. You just have to believe that your instincts are worth listening to. He paused. They thought I was old, alone, gullible. But I wasn't, and neither are you. The room went quiet, then a few claps, then a standing ovation. Rachel whispered, Told you. On the drive home, Frank stopped at the diner. The Rusty Fork, same red booths, same waitress, Barb, who smiled when she saw him. Haven't seen you in a while. Been busy. She poured him coffee. You get that whole situation squared away? Frank stirred his cup. Yeah, turns out sometimes the best tool isn't a wrench or a hammer. It's knowing when to shut up and press record. She laughed. You ever think about writing a book? Frank took a sip. I'm better at fixing things. Still, Barb said, topping off his cup, not many people fix what you fixed. He left a generous tip. Back home, the porch light flicked on as dusk fell. Frank stood on the steps a moment, listening. The house was still. Whole. His. He opened the screen door and walked inside. There was no dramatic music, no applause. Just the simple, solid feeling of safety. He poured himself a glass of water, opened his journal, and wrote, May 18th. The house is quiet again. Emily is healing. The system worked, and I'm still here. He closed the book and smiled. Outside, the wind rustled the dogwood tree. A new season was coming, and Frank Delaney was ready for it. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of the story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.